Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. I'm Jerome CEO of Narrative, and I'm coming to you now because this is our summer season break. We're working on fresh and new content for you all that'll be appearing in your feed in September. But in the meantime, we didn't want to just cut off the feed, and so we chose some replay episodes that we're curating especially for the summer. And this week, we've got a great episode. This one is called Socratic Dialogue. Our guest was Sira Abenoza, who's a professor and also the founder of the Institute for Socratic Dialogue in Barcelona, Spain. And in this episode, you're going to hear a lot about dialogue and building bridges between people that for whom seemingly it would be really, really difficult to build a bridge between. So I hope you enjoy this episode and that you take a lot of things away from it for your own life, career, and teams, wherever you are, and I hope you enjoy your summer. Thanks.
Welcome to Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Story Talks. As you all know, myself, Jerome and Julienne Ryan have been talking about ways that business engage their employees and customers on this podcast. And we're always interested in how storytelling and listening practices, because that's what we do, can help increase engagement. And as a result, we invite people onto this podcast that can show us a little bit of a different perspective so that our listeners and us, quite selfishly, can learn from. So today we have a really special guest who comes all the way from Barcelona in Spain. Her name is Sira Abenoza, and she's the founder of the Institute for Socratic Dialogue, and she's a professor at ESADE, which is a business and law school in Barcelona. And before I talk about too much about what Sira does, and maybe not in the best way, I'm going to let her introduce herself. And really, yes, exactly. And just ask you, Sira, first of all, I want to welcome you to the show. And second, I just want to ask, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, and particularly, why you came to introduce this idea of Socratic dialogue as a professor of business and law, and then you went so far as to actually create an institute for Socratic dialogue. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that journey to get us started.
Sure. Hi, Jerome. Hi, Jules. Thank you so much for inviting me to the show. So my story, I'd say it started mostly when I was a college student. I studied business and philosophy at the same time in two very, very different universities. One was a private business school where most students were concerned about how much money they would make in the future, while at the same time I would be at a public university studying philosophy and having endless discussions on how to make a world a better place. And all that experience, that living in those two very different worlds, grew this desire in me to bring philosophy to the business world. I finished my studies, then I started doing consulting, especially on corporate social responsibility and sustainability, while at the same time I started teaching at the university, teaching corporate social responsibility, because back then there weren't many people already specialized in corporate social responsibility. And since I had both mindsets, I knew about business and I knew about responsibility and philosophy, so I got the chance to teach very, very early in my life. And so for several years, I was trying to help businesses and governments become more responsible and sustainable. And at the same time, I was teaching or trying to teach future business leaders to become more responsible. And as you know, one of the pillars of corporate social responsibility is the idea that a responsible business is a business that is able to engage in dialogue with its stakeholders. That's one of the most central concepts in corporate social responsibilities theory. And so I kept preaching that to businesses and governments and my students, and they seemed to agree with the idea that it did make sense to change the shareholder mindset, this idea of only having to respond to those that own the shares of the company, and instead starting to grow the depth of the engagement with other kinds of stakeholders, such as employees, customers, society in general. But although they seem to agree, as years went by, I realized that at the end of the day, they weren't able to. I actually did this research on the status of corporate social responsibility in Spain back in 2015, I think. And one of them, I'd say maybe the main conclusion, based on all the interviews that we did to the main CSR experts in Spain, was that companies and organizations did not know how to engage in dialogue with their stakeholders. And then I realized, okay, if my desire is to make organizations and leaders more responsible, the first thing that I need to teach them is how to dialogue. That's the first step for them to become responsible professionals. Because our ability to respond has to do with our ability to respond to what others expect and need from us. And before that, we need to know what is it that they need and they want. And based on that realization, I went back to probably the figure that inspired me the most when studying philosophy, which is Socrates, what we've called the father of philosophy, who, instead of most of the philosophers that came afterwards, he practiced philosophy by dialoguing. So he didn't decide to just write down his thoughts and make books about them, but he didn't write a single word. He decided to spend his life engaging in dialogue with the other citizens from Athens, wanting to explore what is it that they thought about the most important things in life. So I decided that I would start teaching dialogue to business students in the form of Socratic dialogue. So based on the Socratic epistemology that we can discuss later on. And so I started teaching that to business students for a couple of years. It was very successful. Suddenly, students from several countries over the world started applying to come to ESADE because they were interested in this course that they couldn't find in their home business schools. So they came to do exchanges at ESADE. And it felt as if, or at least that's what we've been noticing so far, that they made a click based on that, and that's what they tell us now, that they're already business leaders, etc. That changed the way in which they interact with the people around them, be it in their private lives or in their professional lives. No? From there, based on this idea that it is important to learn how to dialogue, and especially to learn how to dialogue with those that are stranger to us, and that at the same time are part of our ecosystem, let's say. And so there was this day in which I realized, hey, we're teaching our law students here all the rules and laws, etc. And they're getting their degrees without having been to jail, without having learned or having known at all about a very important part of the system that they will represent in the future. No? And so I decided that I wanted to teach a Socratic Dialogue course to law students, but in jail. which took me like 2 years to make it happen, because it wasn't easy to convince the university that I was going to take this law students from this private law school to jail and spend 3 months there once a week, and then convince the government, etc. But it finally happened, and it had a very, I'd say, beautiful and deep impact on both sides, on the students and on the inmates as well. And from there, I realized that this need for dialogue was not something special to business or law students, but it was a need that was present in everyone, like in our societies, that for several sociological reasons on how we live our lives today, it seems that it is becoming harder for us to practice the art of dialogue. And that's when I decided that I needed to found an institution that would use dialogue to promote justice and to strengthen our democracies, and to help organizations engage in dialogue with their stakeholders.
Wow.
I know.
It's such a great kind of origin story. And it's interesting because we often talk, Jules, right, about, you come from something happens in your own personal experience. And as a result of that happening in your personal experience, you then sort of apply it to yourself. And then you see that it has an impact on other people. And that's how something grows or has legs. And it's interesting with you, Sira, because that happened, but it's also within the context of seeing, of coming from this corporate social responsibility field and seeing the limitations that you were kind of up against. And so it's an interesting way to get into something where, you were in that corporate world and you were, trying to make some kind of change within the confines of corporate social responsibility, which was probably, in theory, the best place to be making the changes that you had in your mind. But then you realize, well, actually, the whole system just doesn't work because there's this element that's completely fundamentally missing. And then you go about, get out of that system to then create. It's really kind of fascinating how it all came about. Jules, any questions to move on? Because I should say, for the sake of our listeners, in terms of how we met Sira, was really through you, Jules, because you found her TEDx talk, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that origin, and then we could continue the conversation.
Well, yes, thank you. On two things. So curiosity, because I was going to reference Socratic, make a reference to Socrates in a presentation, and I had this brilliant thought. Let me make sure I am positioning that statement appropriately to the clients, and so I went on a little learning journey and then found your TEDx talk, and then did what I do quite a bit lately is reach out on LinkedIn and say, hi, I was just discovering you, and would you be open to a conversation? And took it a step forward. So that combination of thinking a little fresh input, fresh insight, and you never know what can happen when you reach out to somebody and decide to open up a dialogue. One thing came to mind when you were talking before was that we all, with the best intentions and purpose, get stuck in our dialogue. Like all the sustainability, that's like kind of a huge tribe. They have their own version of looking at things. And then you travel to the other tribe of business students and law students. And it's not that anybody's doing anything bad. It's just we get locked into what we're looking at. So I think you were the delta of creating some change and disrupting that along the way, which I think is beautiful. And then while we were getting ready before, I made note of the fact that you have a painting of a musician right behind you. And I think so many of our conversations are like that. It's like music and notes. There's pauses, there's tones, there's emphasis, and it's a great learning prompt when we're thinking about where is our conversations going, like what needs to be changed or enhanced, basically. So those are my thoughts while you're both sharing and thinking. Thanks.
I wonder, Sira, on that note, if how do you sort of see?
So you've talked to us about how this all happened, and what were the issues at the time that made you think, this is what's something, first of all, that people need to learn, and then it's actually something that we need to, I need to found an institute in order to implement this and help people in this way. I wonder today, however many years later, what do you see right now in terms of the need for that kind of dialogue, the Socratic dialogue, and the sort of things that you've put in place through your course or through your institute? What's needed right now? We had there's a podcast that people can listen to. One of our episodes was around leadership at this very moment. And we've talked quite a bit about that in our podcast, about, the kind of leadership that's needed and the shifts that need to happen in how we view leadership. And I'm curious, in terms of this idea of dialogue, do you see any shifts happening? Do you feel like there are things that we need to emphasize right now? What's your take on it?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would say there is a growing need. I'd say in an ideal world, we could close our foundation and start doing something else. But my perception is that there is a growing need, and maybe the pandemic even made things worse, but they were really bad before that as well. So I see a need in a political sense. So most countries and societies are growing and are becoming more polarized politically. And I think social media contribute to that polarization. Like Twitter, for example, is a media in which we tend to love or hate. There's no in between in general terms. And for other reasons. So I see how most countries are becoming more polarized, and there is the need to get people that come from the different extremes, get them together and almost like force them, or invite them to engage in dialogue. But it's almost like forcing them, because initially they're most of the times not wanting to sit down and engage in dialogue with those that think almost opposite to them, no? And I can see that in the US. We've suffered that a lot in Catalonia, which is the name of the region in Barcelona. So we had a referendum for independence 5 years ago, and that polarized the society. And back then, I suggested to different governmental institutions and media here in Catalonia that we had to do a TV show and other initiatives where we would bring together people who would be pro-independence and people who would be against it. And there was a deep reluctance to it. It was not until politicians went to jail and the situation was even worse that I was requested to do something about it. And that's something that I had done previously in Northern Ireland. In 2016, we went to Northern Ireland and we did a dialogue project in which we sat together at the same table, former terrorists from both sides, terrorists who had been fighting for independence and terrorists who had been fighting against independence. And it was just awesome and beautiful to see how through the dialogue process, they were able to finally realize that had they been born on the other side, they might have defended the same ideas. No, it's just how to break the prejudice that others are silly or stupid or enemies or don't get things right. And through dialogue, understand that they have their reasons, that what they feel and what they say is not silly. That we might disagree, but there's some reason there. And that need, I can see it at a political level, very deeply. At a social level, which is not exactly the same. We're doing projects around trying to strengthen democracies and promote civic engagement. So trying to have especially powerful people become more engaged with some of the social problems that we're facing today, be migration, refugees, certain violence, homelessness, etc. So we're creating projects in which we get together business leaders and then migrants and refugees and victims of conflicts, etc., and have them go through a dialogue process that lasts for 3 or 4 months, so that these business leaders that have power of influence, personal power and power thanks to their organizations, they are awakened and they finally decide to engage thanks to connecting with these people that are suffering those social problems. So I see that there's an important need at that level as well. And then I would say at the organization level, there's the same need, because on the one hand, the educational system, at least in Spain, that we have is based on, still unfortunately, is based on the idea that the knowledge is in the hands or in the head of the teachers and the professors, and that they had to instill it in the students, and it doesn't generate the dynamics of empowering students by telling them you have knowledge inside of you. I'm only a kind of a coach or a midwife that will help you give birth to that knowledge, and by that have them understand that their colleagues, their classmates, have that knowledge as well, because it's not only about my teacher empowering me and making me believe that I have knowledge that is worthwhile and that it deserves to be born, but it's the same for everyone that is sitting right beside me, So it changes my attitude towards my equals. And I think that is the key. It's not only how I empower myself, but how I change the way I see others. And my sense is that that is not happening yet. And that is why, because of the education that we receive, and then how society is politically polarized, that makes organizations not keen to dialogue in a way, or not having the habit to do it, because that's not how they have been living. So those leaders, the individuals that lead those organizations, have not acquired that habit. And if they don't have that habit, it is very hard for them to lead in that way, because that's not what they've done before. So if they haven't done it before, why would they do it when they start to lead, unless they at some point realize that is worth it, and they start to practice and then learn the art and make the change, But so
there's a whole bunch of things we could talk about for hours there. I mean, first, what you said about Northern Ireland resonates. I had the opportunity to visit there and see the neighborhoods and the dynamics and have some conversations. So what's been entrenched and where some moves have been made over the last few years. So that's really important. And also the fact that you're talking about everyone has something of value to give and to share their own intuitive knowledge. So being heard, being listened to and appreciated is something so important. I use the term story tourism, like you don't have to live there, but can you visit once in a while and listen to somebody's stories? So very important. And lastly, in companies, you have mergers and acquisitions. You have all these things where there's a us and them, and nobody, spends that much time for a host of different reasons to demystify some of the culture and really pull the value out of the organization that's there in many, many cases. I'm sure there's exceptions, but many cases, unfortunately, it's very much one team wins, somebody else loses, or top down. All the knowledge lives one place. And a lot of what you said about the educational system resonates with me too. So thank you.
And you know what really I think had an impact on me in terms of what you were talking about, Sira, that, you know, society doesn't do this well at large, through education especially. And then, you know, it's that idea that leaders in organizations, for the most part, are sort of following those societal norms. And now what you're saying, what I'm hearing anyway, as a takeaway, is that we actually need to be willing to break what that norm has been and what we've been doing out of habit, and to say, as a leader, you know, I represent this organization, and, you know, there's something that's not working within the way we're creating dialogue with each other, and I need to change it, and it's incumbent upon me. I'm not going to wait for education to catch up. I'm not going to wait for politics to catch up, because if I do, it'll never happen, right? And that's essentially what I heard you saying. And I think that's a really strong paradigm shift, which again aligns with a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, where this is calling, it's another one of those traits. And I say leadership, but really it's an individual trait that we all need to be cultivating and nurturing, is how to listen and how to create dialogue with the people that we most disagree with. And I think the word that kept coming back to me as you were describing these examples, which were really great, it sounds to me like what you witnessed or experienced or facilitated was the creation of empathy. That now I can see myself as another person. And like you were saying, Jules, you know, it's no longer about us versus them. It's, oh, right, we are one. We're all, you know, together. But it's getting through that hurdle and, you know, the initial reluctance. But certainly it's been our experience that once people start to hear the stories of others, you create a whole different kind of understanding, and you know, those labels and those stereotypes, they start to break away. But it, you know, what you're doing, Sira, is creating that space, you know, and inviting people into that space. And I wonder, is that, you know, in terms of people who are listening right now, and that creation of that space, I mean, I understand the sort of mental shift that I might need to do. And I can see how, as an individual, what I can do is take a step back and just listen and put away my judgments and opinions and interpretations and all the things that my assumptions, my preconceptions, stereotypes, that's my work to do. And just so that I can really be present for someone else, which is huge already and not easy. But then there's also this idea, what I'm hearing from your examples is, you know, you're creating a physical space for people to meet in. Is that right? Is that how it's sort of like, I mean, without going into all the details of the process, but just I'm curious about that space. How does that space get created when you bring in people from such different extremes into a room? What do you have to think about when you do that?
Yeah. So we mostly, until the pandemic, we had only done offline experiences, no? So all of us being present at the same place at the same time, and the place itself is something important, and it depends on the individuals that you're trying to bring together. The most extreme case was in Northern Ireland. Those former terrorists who accepted to participate in that experience, they knew they would be criticized by their organization. So in that case, it was very important that we would pick a neutral space, and a space that their organizations would not know about. So it was a secret dialogue. They came with cars with dark glasses so that no one could see them. and they came secretly. So in that case, the space was especially critical. And that would be an extreme case. But so in general terms, it is important that it becomes a quiet and gradually a safe space. It is very important that we all sit in a circle. That's it's probably obvious, but it is important that we never forget about the importance of all of us seeing each other, because that's how you show this Socratic theory of knowledge, which is the knowledge is inside all of us. That's why we need to see each other. That's something very, very critical. And then there are a couple norms. So our approach is pluralistic, but not relativistic, in the sense that although we defend that in the 21st century, as opposed to back in Socrates' time, we don't have universal truths and universal answers to questions. We have learned the hard way that we need to respect diversity. So that is something very important, and that justifies and explains the importance of listening to others that think differently. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that anything goes. So it's not a relativistic space in which you can say whatever and defend whatever. So there's the norm of the universal moral respect, which implies that anyone's opinion is deserves the same amount of respect, as long as it doesn't disrespect anyone. So any opinion that might potentially imply the suffering of someone else will not be respected, no? And that takes us to participants becoming allies in helping each other identify those ideas that we defend and that either don't make sense or are illogical or might become hurtful for someone or unjust or unfair, no? And so what the space becomes is a collaborative space in which we help each other enlarge our mentality, so understand different perspectives and positions that we hadn't conceived ourselves previously, while at the same time helping each other identify those ideas that some of us or one of us or whoever might be defending today, and that probably in the future might sound as if what we think of today about slavery, no? 2,500 years ago, slavery was something that was accepted. There are things that we're defending today that probably in a couple decades or in a century will sound outrageous to the people who will live there then. And it's this shared effort of trying to identify that, no, all together. And that implies that it is very important that everyone feels safe, and that that it is not a competitive space in which my desire or my pull is to be the smartest guy in the room, but that I understand that whatever comes out as a result of the process is a result and a gain for everyone. No one owns it. It's something that is that happens thanks to all of us, and that we have to collaborate for that, no, and not see the other or what the other says about what I say and what I defend as a threat, but see that as a chance to improve and to learn. So the space, so beyond the physical elements, has to become a safe space in that regard, no? It's a space in which I feel others as benevolent beings that want the best for me and for them.
Yeah. Assuming, I heard one senior leader from a very big company in the US say once that one of the secrets to her communication success is to always assume positive intent, even if there may be strong evidence in her mind that it wasn't positive. But when you come with that attitude, it changes things, because again, you're not going with your assumptions, and as you're truly there to listen and understand another person's point of view, and see that they're coming at it. We're all in this together is sort of how I would translate that. As you were talking, I was making notes, and it's really interesting because if we bring this back to to the business world and how we habitually do things in the business world. I remember one of my first jobs was working in a bank, and on the marketing side of things, and we'd have these meetings on Monday mornings. And you talked about how the people in Northern Ireland, they agreed to come to those meetings, and they agreed to a certain number of conditions, right? It has to be secret. We have to, otherwise we'll be criticized, etc. No one ever agreed to these Monday morning meetings. It was sort of and no one knew, to the point that after a while, I don't know when they started, but it was before I started. I was in that company for 4 years, and you just went to these meetings, but nobody knew. There was never a memo or an email going out saying why we're having these meetings. It's just the Monday morning meeting where we talk about the business and what we're going to do next and what we've done. And there was an assumption that everybody in the room agreed to that. And the result, and I've always kept this in my mind because it's one of the things that actually made me quit that job, is that we would do these things very habitually without any question asked around, why are we doing this again? And you would see the result in the room, and no one thought to ask why, including me, of why we were doing this. But you would see the result in the room was that nobody was actually listening or paying attention. And so many people in that company were leaving every few months. And the leaders in that company were wondering why. They thought it's just because other people pay better. And so I think that fundamental key idea for anybody who's listening is, when you have a meeting, agree as to why you're having that meeting and why you've asked these people to be in that meeting, right? It's kind of like your story of, you being requested finally with the Catalonia issues, requested to be part of it. You were asked. There's no coercion here. There's no forcing people to do something, because that just doesn't work. And we're talking about extreme kind of world events, but I think it's really true for a company too. And the other point I took away was the confidentiality aspect. That we agree that if that is appropriate, that whatever's said in the room stays in the room. And if it doesn't, we agree that it can go out of the room. Sitting in a circle, I love that, so that people can see each other. It's what we do in our workshops when people tell stories to one another. And you're right, it sounds obvious to you, but I think when you think of, the corporate setting again, it's not obvious, because you look at these, these open desks and that kind of thing. Circles are rare. Still today, there's a little bit more of it, and there's more of a, less hierarchical kind of, organizations that are emerging. But this idea of the circle, it's so simple, and it's just shifting around a few seats so that people can see each other. That's really what's important. And then the other thing I just wanted to point out was the diversity issue that you brought up, and bringing in people who represent different demographics of the company or whatever it is, and at the same time have the same agreed, shared goal or outcome. We're again all in this together, and we see it as a chance to improve and to learn. I think that those, I'm taking these words from what you said and sort of putting them under this umbrella of the business side as well, because I really do think it's all very applicable.
And these are not things that are so difficult to do. We often say in our work that all we need is a space and a time. And that's really all we need. And then we'll find people to fill that space and time. But we have to start with that space and time first.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, you know, I think that's my way of bringing it all together in terms of things that people can take away from this. We're almost at time, but I'll let Jules maybe give us a parting thought or two.
First of all, Sira,
Question.
Thank you. Yeah, Sira, I think what you've shared in even these short moments are so valuable, because so many times we think we're stuck in dynamics. And these two examples you used about the lawyers and the inmates, and then Northern Ireland, where people are navigating so much pain, so much anger, so much loss. And to bring those examples back to the workplace and going, you think you're stuck in dynamics and you have loss or fear? Here's an example of people who took a chance to move it through. So I think that's valuable. The other thing, the other thought, separate, is I wonder what Socrates would think about this, because we ask very long questions, but we are very enthusiastic and appreciative about your work. And we are not looking at this as a one and done. We hope this is a beginning of a conversation, because there's more sharings to have and more learnings. And we appreciate you taking the time and taking my message, saying hi. So you never know. I think that's the start of many good opportunities. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I love those parting words. You never know. That's a great. It's a great way to leave our question, to leave or a statement to leave our audience with, because I think that's what happens in a space that you create, whether it's online or offline. By the way, you know, of just agreeing to enter a room and to just see what happens, essentially, and come with that sort of attitude, I think is beautiful. So yes, I echo everything that Jules said. Thank you so much, Sira, for being part of this. Is there anything that you would want our listeners to know about you in terms of where to find resources, or you know, if they have any questions that they want to follow up with?
Yeah, sure. So our website is institutesocratic.com, and we can make available the two documentaries based on the work that we do. So there's the documentary based on the work that we do in jail. It's called Philosophy Behind Bars, and it shows the experience of a group of law students doing the Socratic Dialogue course in jail. And it portrays very well the experience that both sides have when going through that dialogue process. And then there's the documentary of the experience in Northern Ireland, the documentary of the dialogue process that we did there, that is called In Dialogue. And we can share both links so that if anyone is interested in watching them, they can do it.
Great, fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing that. So yes, so look for these links and resources in our show notes. Once again, our podcast is Story Talks, and I want to encourage everyone to go back to our library of episodes and learn more about other related topics that we've talked around leadership and engagement, and how a paradigm shift is needed at this moment. And this, to me, is all part of that. And of course, go back to the show notes, which will summarize some of these takeaways that I summarized a little bit earlier in terms of what you can do in your own companies and businesses and organizations, wherever you might be. It's never as difficult as you think it is. It all begins with you. And finally, if you want to learn more about what we do at Narrative, what Jules and I do as storytelling practitioners and facilitators of training programs, you can go to narrative.com. That's NARATIV.com. And there you will learn how you can bring us into your organizations to help you engage your workforce, your customers, your stakeholders through the art of storytelling, but also listening. And today we've learned a lot about listening through Sira's contributions. So thank you so much once again. And thanks to everyone who's listened. And we will see you next time.
Narrative Story Talks. For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.